I went into Rush of Blood expecting a fun roller coaster ride, but what I really got out of it was an exciting revival of the traditional rail shooter genre. Games like Time Crisis and House of the Dead, hell, Rush of Blood is practically a spiritual successor to Carnival. Well, before getting deeper into this review, it's fair to say that I'm extremely biased. Light gun games are just about my favorite genre, and I own most of the major ones on PlayStation 1 and 2. As well as an old CRT television purely for these kind of games. That's why I'm going to pretty much give this game a pass, although it is a little disappointing overall.
Back in business, hippity-ho! 1 minute we stop, 1 minute we go. Just wait and see what's around the bend, and I'll see you when you reach the end. Shoot!
There's not much of a story to Rush of Blood. Certainly not one that's overtly presented. You're simply going through a fun roller coaster ride when a psychopath sends you on the wrong rail and now you have to fight your way back.
Looks like we're on the wrong path. It seems we've landed on the old ghost train. Proceed with caution.
There are some hints along the way that none of the ride is real and that it's all taking place in the main character's head, but it was also subtle and I was expecting a big reveal that never came. I'm sure it's meant to tie in with the game Until Dawn, of which Rush of Blood is a spin-off of sorts, although I still haven't had the opportunity to finish the original game, so I'm likely missing out on some stuff. However, there are some clear references to that game which I do recognize, and they were really cool when they did show up. The animations of the enemies is pretty hit and miss. Granted, most of them are zombies or moving mannequins, so it's okay for them to look a little janky and have odd motions. But sometimes things just don't look right at all. Here, I kill these demon spiders in one shot, and then they just freeze in place before suddenly disappearing. But for the most part, enemies look pretty good. The psychiatrist character from Until Dawn returns as a carnival host, and just like in the original game, his motion capture animation and voice actor here are absolutely phenomenal.
Well, now, listen up, listen up. Things have taken an unexpected turn, and I'm the first to admit that we need things corrected. Now, there's just one more thing. Don't be alarmed. You've inhaled a gas. And while there's no harm in it, there is one little side effect. You may start to see things that aren't really there. Which is why I hesitate.
Really top-notch stuff. It's a shame that there isn't much of a story, since I'd love to see more of this guy, but I do understand that that's not the point of this game. In case it's not clear already, this is a virtual reality game that incorporates two of the technology's greatest strengths: spooky scares and roller coaster rides. Most of the horror comes in the form of unapologetic jump scares. I'm not a big fan of those personally, but Rush of Blood does handle the cheap tactic fairly well. Sound effects will often surround the player, calling for them to look in one direction or another, which turns out to be an effective setup. Headphones are pretty much required for this to work though, so if you don't have at least basic stereo headphones, then this will likely be lost on you. The scares are also set up in such a way that they won't activate unless you're looking in the right direction. It works most of the time, although a few moments might feel awkward because of it. Headphones don't just help in an aesthetic sense either, since enemies can come from multiple directions, so it helps a lot to be able to hear where they're coming from. It's not flawless, and it isn't as effective during the game's louder moments or for enemies that use projectiles. The environments and monster designs carry the horror vibe very well. The way that spiders slowly crawl onto the player's cart is great, as well as when these psychos in pig masks rush the player in strobe lights. So even when cheap jump scares aren't utilized, it's still an uncomfortably fun ride to go through. And speaking of a fun ride, it's surprisingly exhilarating when the coaster goes fast. The first time this is done works as a great example of how effective virtual reality can be for those who haven't experienced it yet. I've never thrown up playing the game, but it definitely turned my stomach a little and gave me a unique sensation. Any time that isn't action-packed is still a ton of fun, whether it's to observe the surroundings or feel the coaster's simulated speed. The gameplay at its core is essentially a rail shooter. 2 separate motion controllers are used to represent each hand, and I'm absolutely shocked to admit that aiming and shooting actually works pretty well. Part of what killed the genre, for me, was the move from light gun technology to motion sensors. Most people seem to have been fine with House of the Dead on the Wii, but it felt like a slap in the face to me. And the only reason why I found Umbrella Chronicles to be palatable was because of how slow-paced it was. Now, don't get me wrong, Sony's motion controllers still don't match up to Namco's Gun-Con 2 or even the Mad Catz Dream Blaster. But this is a suitable replacement, at least for how it's utilized here. It feels less like I'm dragging a crosshair, and much more so like I'm aiming naturally. I'm sure a big part of this is due to the player's virtual arms appearing on screen, as well as the sense of presence provided by the virtual reality headset. Whatever the case is, I'm just glad that it feels good. Unfortunately, attempting to aim down the sights of a gun doesn't work quite so well, and I don't really understand why. It's fine in VR worlds, and unless I'm mistaken, its very practice plays a major role in Farpoint. Thankfully, the gun's built-in flashlights are suitable crosshairs, and unlike previous efforts with the Wii's rail shooters, aiming is pretty close to 1-to-1 with the player's actual motions. The game also does a wonderful job at splitting the player's attention and demanding multitasking. Enemies often come from 2 or more directions, which requires the player to be dexterous with both hands. These are the best parts of the game, and are really exciting to go through. Power-ups are also scattered throughout each level and can be selected for each hand. I soon found myself preferring the highly accurate revolver in my right hand and the more forgiving shotgun in my left. Light gun games have typically been very difficult for me to dual wield, but it feels natural here, and it's a lot of fun. It's also worth noting that the game can be played with the DualShock 4's built-in motion controls, and I gotta give the developers credit for attempting to implement it, but it's hardly an acceptable alternative in comparison. For all intents and purposes, 2 motion controls are absolutely mandatory here. I really enjoy this game, and most of that comes from my bias with the genre, but there are some major misgivings here that require attention. Like I mentioned before, animations are both good and not so good depending on the part of the game, but what really sucks is the PlayStation 4's and VR headsets' underperformance. Even larger text in the distance looks plain bad, but it does manage to clear up a lot up close. What's a lot more degrading of this game's quality is its difficulty. On the 2 higher difficulties, Insane and Psychotic, many attacks are either one-shot kills or otherwise deal tremendous damage. The first 2 levels aren't too bad, although there's not a whole lot of action in level 2 anyway. From level 3 and onwards, the game starts to take a lot of cheap shots. There's a part where the player has to shoot a boss in front while enemies from above throw projectiles. Every single attack here is a one-shot kill, and while aiming in front works fine, aiming along the edges isn't as accurate. Eventually, anyone will get it with enough retries, but it never feels fair. It's like you have to have clairvoyance in order to pass sections like this. God forbid you play on the highest difficulty, which restarts the entire level upon a single death. It may sound like a stressful and exciting challenge, but not when cheap shots are taken so often. The number of times I had to retry at a checkpoint nearly killed my enjoyment, and it's for that reason why I recommend the normal difficulty. It's a little too easy overall, but it's a lot better than plain cheap. The headset and motion controls are also prone to needing recalibration, especially after having to quickly lean side to side to avoid hazards, and this never stops being annoying. It's also close to impossible to aim behind you. Thankfully, this is never required, but if you miss a target, then you can pretty much forget about getting a second chance at it, even though this is kind of one of the things that VR should be good at. But I suppose that's part of the takeaway to keeping Sony's VR setup cheaper than the competition, what with only having one camera source and cheaper motion controls as compared to HTC Vive or Oculus Rift. What I don't understand, however, is why the player is forced and confined within their cart. I'm barely allowed to look over the sides before the game's invisible barriers prevent my progress. Other games like Resident Evil 7 and Job Simulator don't seem to have this problem. It's really not a big deal, but it does seem like a simple oversight. Maybe because this was a launch title on new technology, the developers didn't want to overstep their boundaries? I don't know. It's unfortunate how short this game is, clocking in at about 2 hours, maybe adding an extra 30 minutes due to retries on the insane difficulty. Forget about psychotic difficulty. To be fair, 2 hours is kind of standard for traditional rail shooters, but I am spoiled by the myriad of extra modes that are common in past light gun games, so their complete absence here makes the short campaign hurt even worse. There are little secrets and alternate paths to discover, but nothing major or anywhere near as cool as in the House of the Dead series, for example. If you love rail shooters as much as I do, you gotta play this game if only because there's not a whole lot else out there anymore. While it doesn't compare to the genre's best, it's still the best to have come out in a very long time. If you don't really care for rail shooters, then it's a lot harder to recommend. The VR effects are awesome, and the motion controls are usually tight, so it's a really fun 2-hour ride with the occasional break to recalibrate. At the current full price of $20, it can be a little tough to stomach, and considering how little replay value there is here, it's likely a game that's going to be played once, maybe twice, and that's it. The constant retries during tougher segments on higher difficulties is pretty annoying. Whenever the player has to go through a slower segment again and again, it feels like sitting through an unskippable cutscene. These scares are great the first time around, but they're obviously not as effective when the player is forced to see them on repeat. This game is in no way worth getting the PlayStation VR headset for, but it's definitely worth considering if you do have it. Thank you for watching my review on Until Dawn: Rush of Blood. If you enjoyed this video, click the like button, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe.